Okay, so we are moving on now. We're picking up here on the pituitary gland, and remember the pituitary is made up of an anterior and posterior pituitary, and the anterior portion, the adenohypophysis, makes 7 hormones. It's very glandular, and in a picture you'll see very soon here, you'll see it looks kind of mushy. It's basically a collection of lots of cells that are going to be secreting the hormones into a capillary bed within the adenohypophysis. The posterior lobe, the neurohypophysis, this is the part that's not glandular. It's a series of basically axons that are synapsing onto a set of cells that are going to release hormones into the posterior lobe. So this is what we're looking at here. So here is where the pituitary is, down at the base of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is this region up here. Okay, you can't really see it, but here's the optic chiasm, so that's the crossover, remember, between the right and left eyes. Which cranial nerve is that, everybody? Try to remember there. The third ventricle is up on top, and you'll see right here, this is the infundibulum, this region right here. The infundibulum is this stalk that that connects the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary to the hypothalamus. So the anterior lobe is made up of the pars tubularis, pars distalis, and pars intermedia right here. These are the different groups of cells that are going to be producing different types of hormones that will be secreted into the bloodstream. So if you look over here at the difference between the anterior and the posterior lobe, the pars nervosa, it looks like there's a lot of connective tissue in there, and what you're looking at actually are a bunch of axons. So here's the pars nervosa on this side, right? And you can see that there's a lot of white matter in there. And then the pars distalis, intermedia, and tubularis, which would be up higher, looks very glandular, and there's a lot of vascularization here. Vascularization, of course, is how these hormones are being transported out to their target tissues. And then the mammillary body's right up here to the right. So, what hormones are in the adenohypophysis? What part is that, guys? Anterior or posterior? Figure that out real quick. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is what is going to cause the adrenals to start secreting its products in response to something that happens to threaten homeostasis. Luteinizing hormone, which is also called gonadotropin. This induces ovulation, produces progestin by the ovaries. This kind of starts to trigger reproductive processes in females. In males, it produces androgens, and signals regulation of the testes in males. Follicle-stimulating hormone, another gonadotropin, is what signals the development of follicles, which will eventually develop into ova in females. And then the follicle-stimulation hormone also works in males, and that causes the maturation of sperm. So basically, you can kind of think about FSH, gonadotropin, as regulating meiosis in gonads. And one of the big deals with gonadotropic is that this is a hormone that regulates gonadal activity. Without SFH, then the gonads are going to not be producing sperm and ova adequately for reproduction in males or females. Growth hormone, yep, some of us got more than others. It stimulates growth of muscle and bone. It also causes the liver to produce other hormones that not only stimulate but support growth. It allows regulation of hormones that are going to trickle down to, hormone actions that trickle down to muscle. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, this is released from the thyroid, and this is going to help set your basic metabolic rate in response to energy use and consumption. This is where we do talk a little bit about metabolism and calories, I guess you could say. How effectively are you using your food molecules or biomolecules for producing not only tissues in the body, so transitioning, let's say, the protein you ate last night into muscle that you might be building today, but also regulating the use of energy in the conversion of biomolecules to ATP. Prolactin is a hormone that is going to stimulate production of milk during pregnancy, so obviously that's not always going to be active in a female. And then melanocyte stimulating hormone. This is where you have the production of melanin in response to changes in the environment. And so you're usually not going to see this in healthy adults, but you will see this in pregnant women, children, and very early fetal development. And so melanocyte stimulating hormone is a part of what gives women that little brown band down the center of their belly as they are developing a fetus, because pregnant women will see an increased melanocyte stimulating hormone because of the production of MSH in fetal development. So mom gets a little extra coloring because of that. Now that's the anterior. The posterior portion, or the neurohypophysis, produces only two things: oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH. ADH is also called vasopressin, so you might see that in some of the literature. Oxytocin in females stimulates uterine contraction and contraction of smooth muscle in the mammary tissue in response to reproduction, so childbirth, and in milk letdown. So oxytocin is super important for lactating females. In males, it allows contraction for smooth muscle in the prostate gland, again for reproductive purposes, and both oxytocin and ADH are stored in the neurohypophysis until they're released, until they're used. Now in terms of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, this is a hormone that our body uses constantly. The target of ADH is the kidneys and the blood vessels peripheral to the kidneys. And what it's going to do is it's going to decrease the amount of urination or water loss by changing blood pressure going out to the kidneys, and also kind of regulating how water is reabsorbed. And that's going to adjust the solute concentration of the blood plasma. So basically, if you have enough water in your system, ADH goes down. Right? You can get rid of it. You can have a diuretic effect. If you are thirsty, if you are dehydrated, ADH goes up, anti-diuretic. Therefore, you won't be urinating as often. And again, in this case, the diuretic means to release water from the renal system. And so here's just a real simple example of activation of the pituitary. So secretion of hormones are going to control whether or not the anterior pituitary is releasing hormones into the bloodstream. Those hormones will only activate cells that have a receptor for the given hormone. Over here, a group of sympathetic neurons may be talking to the adrenals. The adrenals will also secrete, in an endocrine response, epinephrine or norepinephrine, depending on what's necessary for that response. Over here we have preganglionic motor nerve fibers also synapsing in the adrenal medulla, causing the secretion of epinephrine or norepinephrine. Over here we're looking at number 2. I guess I should have gotten number 2 first, right? The production of ADH and oxytocin right here in the posterior pituitary. Cells in the hypothalamus will start firing action potentials to contact the cells, or not to contact cells, but to release ADH or oxytocin, whichever one is necessary, into the posterior pituitary. And this also is highly vascularized, so those blood vessels are going to be taking the hormone away to the targets. So here's the difference. Anterior, you have cells in the hypothalamus talking to the cells within the anterior pituitary. So it's like you have presynaptic cell, postsynaptic cell, and the postsynaptic cell is secreting into the bloodstream. Over here, the actual hypothalamic neurons are extending down through the tissue into the posterior pituitary, releasing either ADH or oxytocin. Totally different thing. So here's an example of regulatory mechanisms using specific hormones from the anterior or posterior pituitary and what the control is going to be. Hypothalamus, direct control by the nervous system. Over here, And then over here, direct release of hormones, and I'm sorry, that was anterior. This is the posterior, direct release of hormones into the bloodstream, which is regulating the kidneys, smooth muscles in the vas deferens, and so forth. Oxytocin in females for contraction of smooth muscle in the uterine muscles, or in mammary tissue. All right, so that was a basic rundown of what's happening in the pituitary. You're going to learn a lot more about that in physiology. Let's move on to the thyroid. The thyroid gland is found near the larynx, and the thyroid is going to be producing thyroxine, or T4, triiodothyroxine, thyroidine, thyroidine, T3, or calcitonin. And these compounds are going to be responsible for setting your basic metabolic rate. So the anterior surface is found near the trachea. There are two lobes, butterfly shaped, and that's what you're seeing here. And they connect anteriorly, or to the back, via a portion called the isthmus. So thyroxine is produced by follicle cells. It stimulates your metabolism. It stimulates the use of energy-carrying molecules, and it's regulated by TRH and TSH. Calcitonin, on the other hand, is going to be made by something else called a parafollicular cell. And this is going to change or decrease the amount of ionic calcium in the blood, which is going to inhibit osteoclasts and calcium excretion into kidneys. Basically what it does is it allows bone to not release calcium. And so here's an example of what the thyroid looks like. The thyroid is highly vascularized. Again, with any of these endocrine organs, you're going to see lots of blood vessels associated with them to carry away the hormone into where it's needed in the body, to the targets. These are the thyroid follicles. Follicles always look like little swimming pools to me. I don't know why. And then surrounding the follicles, you're going to find the little subfollicular cells. The follicles themselves are going to be making T4 and T3. It's then released into the vasculature where it's carried to targets to do what it needs to do. That's all you need to know about the thyroid, is how it holds on to the surrounding tissue via the isthmus. It's highly vascularized. I'm not going to ask you right now about the names of any of the blood vessels. And then what the follicles and the subfollicular cells look like. What does this thing look like when you take a picture of it? Okay, so now we are going to move on to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are kind of fun. They sit on top of the kidneys, and the adrenals are important for regulating all kinds of stress reactions to the environment. So here are the adrenals sitting on top of both the right and the left kidney. They are, we call them suprarenal. In other words, they sit on top, and they are fed by the suprarenal arteries. The adrenal glands can be broken down into a cortex and a medulla. Now, one of the things that I want to mention right now is that in other parts of the body, you're going to be seeing the term cortex or medulla, and that actually means something in terms of the actual structure. A cortex is always going to look kind of like stacked cells, kind of like columns, and a medulla is going to look kind of like a mash of cells, just kind of clustered together. So over here you can see in the adrenal cortex there are three zones: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis, going from the superficial, where the capsule is. The capsule is the connective tissue outside of the adrenals, extending deep into the cortex, so moving from top to bottom here. And then you have the adrenal medulla here, which is the center portion. The adrenal medulla itself is going to carry a lot of vascularization. So what do you see in the adrenals? The cortex, the three layers, the glomerulosa, makes aldosterone, helps you keep sodium in your bloodstream. The zona fasciculata makes cortisone. This is basically going to help in the regulation of glucose and glycogen in your body. And then the zona reticularis makes testosterone. It does stimulate libido, but it can also facilitate bone maintenance and also building bigger muscle. The adrenal medulla itself, the inner region, is controlled autonomically, and it makes epinephrine and norepinephrine. Remember, epinephrine's other word is adrenaline, and norepinephrine is noradrenaline. We will pick up in the next video because I'm out of my 15 minutes right now.